van der Kolk's research has drawn on the disciplines of neuroscience, developmental psychopathology, and interpersonal neurobiology. Together, these three disciplines have shown that trauma does, indeed, rewire physical and mental perceptions. For the victim, the world is filled with threats and dangers. The author draws on three forms of treatment to address this reorganization of the body and mind: top-down treatment, medication, and bottom-up treatment. Top-down treatment is achieved by talking and processing the many complexities of trauma. Medicines work to stabilize the mind's alarm system and reactions. And bottom-up treatment puts the patient in situations designed to counter the feelings of helplessness that victims often feel. Of course, each survivor will require a different approach, usually a combination of 2 or 3 types of treatment. Top-down treatment is based on the idea that processing traumatic events by talking them out is an essential step towards moving past them. During this kind of therapy, a survivor will recount the event in great detail. In this way, survivors work to understand their trauma and the circumstances surrounding it. The limitation with this form of treatment, however, is that trauma is proverbal. Because of its nature, it strips us of the ability to share experiences through language. It renders us speechless. Though it can be relived and re-experienced in the physical sense, it is difficult to articulate. Bottom-up treatments target the autonomic nervous system through breathing, movement, and physical touch. One vehicle of therapy might be yoga, for instance. These forms of treatment acknowledge that patients will not forget their trauma, but instead build new memories that make them feel the opposite of what their trauma does. Where trauma may give feelings of fear, panic, and anxiety, bottom-up treatments work to build feelings of safety and security. It is based on the premise that survivors need to develop familiar experiences that contradict feelings caused by trauma. In this way, bottom-up treatments aim to recalibrate the brain and train survivors to return to their pre-traumatic selves. Through decades in his field, van der Kolk has witnessed an unimaginable pharmacological revolution. Responsible for a drastic reduction in the number of patients in mental hospitals in America, antipsychotic medicines have completely changed psychiatry. Though their results are impressive, the author argues that medications are not without their problems. They may hinder the process of addressing underlying issues, often leading to dependency. At the same time, the socioeconomic implications of antipsychotic medicines pose moral and ethical concerns. Traumatized children from poorer backgrounds are more likely to receive medications to make them easier to deal with, as a kind of quick fix. The author uses this fact to argue that medicine has quickly become the preferred choice in psychiatry, where alternative treatments should be considered with as much seriousness. In The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk explores the long-lasting effects of trauma on the human body and psyche. Drawing on decades of experience as a researcher and clinician, he shares his study's extensive results on the impact of trauma, often focusing on childhood trauma and its enduring legacy in our lives. With years of study as a basis, the psychiatrist also argues that trauma's potential to affect its victims' physical, mental, social, and economic experiences makes it a public health concern, and it should be treated as such. Having spent years working with trauma victims and patients, Dr. van der Kolk also explores several treatments for trauma, critiquing each as he goes on. The Body Keeps the Score is an impactful look at how relationships make and break us, for better and for worse. It implies that all human beings experience trauma in one way or another. There is always hope for recovery and the reclamation of power and joy. Dr. van der Kolk begins by acknowledging the universality of trauma. Popular perspectives of trauma make it easy to believe that it is something experienced by victims of extreme cases like war or famine. The author, however, argues differently. He states that trauma is more common than we think and that it happens to us and those closest to us, regardless of how it chooses to manifest itself. Statistics suggest that a substantial number of Americans have been victims of sexual abuse and domestic violence in their childhoods. Yet, because human beings are so resilient, we carry trauma in our day-to-day lives with remarkable stoicism. In itself, this response is a side effect of trauma, through which a victim tries to push recollections of the trauma out of their mind. The premise of this book is that trauma continues to fester long after it has been inflicted. Traumatic experiences affect how victims view the world, navigate interpersonal relationships, regulate emotions, and open themselves up to enjoyment. Victims will often live their lives on the edge, with constant anxiety that says, "Be alert, something is going to go wrong." The smallest sign of endangerment may trigger excessive stress and agitation, causing victims to act irrationally. These feelings are difficult to control, and they can make victims feel as though they are constantly unable to control their own lives. Victims are often aware that this hypervigilance is unwarranted yet are still unable to overcome it through reason. Other times, victims will be numb and unable to feel or make emotional connections with others. Both of these contrasting responses illustrate the effects of trauma on the brain and that victims' actions and reactions are often involuntary. The chronic anger and fear that trauma induces can lead to very real physical symptoms. The muscle tension resulting from constant stress and anxiety makes the body susceptible to aches and pains, inflammation, spasms, headaches, and many other forms of pain. Physical repercussions can even go as far as digestive issues. In cases of physical pain from stress and trauma, prescribed medications that simply target the pain itself are often only temporary relief. Since these medications do not target the underlying cause, victims of trauma often have chronic conditions. Through these and many other examples, Dr. van der Kolk illustrates that trauma does not only change the brain's wiring but takes on a severe physiological presence. Because of the numbness caused by trauma, some victims may seek experiences that they believe will make them feel alive once more. Dr. van der Kolk's experiences with these victims suggest that they feel bored and empty when they are not under emotional pressure or duress, or when they are not engaging in risky behavior. This may explain the tendency that trauma victims have toward dangerous activities and people who are toxic to them. The line between safety and danger is blurred in some instances, while pain turns to pleasure. The author cites an example of a victim of abuse who is continuously attracted to romantic relationships in which she is abused. In this way, trauma may cause a compulsion to gain control of a painful experience by reliving it. Trauma affects our ability to trust others. This is why it is extremely difficult for trauma survivors to engage in intimate relationships and make meaningful connections with others. Part of working through trauma, then, is by ensuring that a traumatized person has ample social support. Like all human beings, those who are working through trauma need to feel valued and as they belong. They need to be affirmed and know that they matter to someone. But for that to happen, survivors must be able to let their guards down, the same guards that were put up as a result of trauma. Simply put, intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability does not come easily to victims of trauma. Therefore, any trauma treatment must address the issue of trust. It must work to restore the faith one has in others, and it must ensure that recovery happens with loved ones and support groups all around. Guilt and shame are amongst the most common effects of trauma. Many survivors fixate on how they acted during the traumatic experience, or that it may have been their fault. People may hate themselves for how they felt, too afraid, too loud, too soft, too slow, or too dependent. These feelings of guilt are amplified when the abuser is someone that the victim knows well or even trusted. Victims may experience cognitive dissonance, in which they go between feeling wronged and feeling as though they may have been willing participants in the abuse. This shame, of course, hinders the ability to speak and open up about trauma, which can make treatment even more difficult. Van der Kolk maintains that letting go of this guilt and shame is a crucial part of treatment and that it needs to be actively addressed.